India's government once again tries to push through controversial reforms to open up its lucrative retail sector to international investors. But opposition parties and trade unions are up in arms and say the move is a betrayal of democracy. We ask, are these reforms a shot in the arm for India's troubled economy? And is the political fallout likely to overwhelm the shaky coalition that rules the country? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Darren Jordan. India's coalition government is once again facing political turmoil over new economic reforms approved last week. Well, the plan includes opening up the country's retail and aviation sectors to foreign investment. But opposition parties and trade unions say it betrays the country's democracy. From New Delhi, our correspondent Purna Suri reports.
Anger on India's streets as protesters rally against one of the country's biggest spending cuts in recent history. At the heart of their protest is the government's decision to allow foreign retail chain stores like Carrefour and Walmart to open shop in India. In a country where millions depend on working in small shops like these, they say it's unfair.
The local retailing business, those people associated with it, will really suffer, and the country's economy will suffer.
In Odisha state, protesters take out their anger at a recent increase in fuel prices on public transportation, blocking trains and traffic. In Uttar Pradesh, more people came out on the streets shouting anti-government slogans.
The entire country is united. This is not a strike, but a revolution by the public.
In New Delhi, the protest was smaller in size, but bigger in political clout. Leaders from the opposition put up a brave united front, even as a handful of supporters rallied in the city's protest street near Jantar Mantar.
Many of the people that you're seeing protesting here are members from different political parties. There are shopkeepers, traders, lorry drivers here who are saying their livelihoods will be snatched away if these economic overhauls are actually implemented.
Despite this opposition, the government so far says it will not reverse its decisions. India's inability in the past months to push through major reforms has put it in danger of becoming the first of the big BRICS emerging economies to see its credit rating downgraded to junk. That's why these reforms are needed. But politically, pressure against the coalition government is building up. A key ally has withdrawn support from the government just 2 years before elections are due, forcing some to think the government may compromise. But until that happens, the challenges for Prime Minister Manmohan Singh remain as he tries to steer the economy and, more importantly, convince his people that it's in their interest to follow him. Purna Suri for Inside Story, New Delhi.
Well, Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh has justified the decision to allow foreign direct investment, or FDI, in multi-brand retailers. He said, "I believe that these steps will help strengthen our growth process and generate employment in these difficult times." And he added, "I urge all segments of public opinion to support the steps we have taken in the national interest." Well, India has taken a number of steps to curb its rising budget deficit. The proposals start with efforts to reform the retail sector. The government wants to allow foreign investment in retail trade, allowing chain stores like Tesco and Walmart to open mega stores. It has also limited the amount of government subsidies on liquid petroleum gas widely used for cooking, and has cut diesel subsidies, causing the price of fuel to rise. Well, retail is the largest industry in India. It accounts for 14% of the country's GDP and around 8% of employment. The size of India's retail sector is currently estimated at around $450 billion. India ranks 5th among the top 30 emerging markets for retail sales. So, what are the motives behind the new series of retail reforms in India? Well, to answer this question, we're joined by our guests. In New Delhi, Chetan Sharma, an independent financial analyst. In London, James Mayner, a professor of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London. And also in London, Radha D'Souza, Associate Professor of Law and Development at the University of Westminster. Welcome to you all. Chetan Sharma in New Delhi, let me start with you, if I may. This is a very controversial set of reforms that the government has tried in the past. It was forced to back down the last time round. Why is this good for the Indian economy?
Well, there are three reforms really in question. One would be the diesel price hike. The second would be FDI in retail as well as airlines. Now, as far as diesel price hikes is concerned, as an economist, I don't think there's any argument. It needs to be done. We need to free our pricing of the oil mechanism simply because 70% of our oil is imported. And having said that, our prices are heavily subsidized. We've begun to take our grants for granted, and it's become an inefficient use of fuel. Yes, one can argue it's going to fuel up inflation to some extent, but we've got to live with that. And freeing of prices controlled from the fuel mechanism is very, very relevant. In fact, this is something the government has been advocating for a while, all governments, and it needs to be done. Now, the point is, how are you going to bite the bullet? We've bitten it a couple of times. There have been a few rollbacks, but perhaps this time round, there wouldn't be one politically because there's anyway a lot of outside support that's coming in for this particular reform.
Okay, let's put that to Radha D'Souza in London. Radha D'Souza, the last time the government proposed these reforms, it did a dramatic U-turn and suspended them after fierce opposition from its allies in the coalition, from its political rivals. But let me ask you, why shouldn't the government open up a retail sector that's unorganised and has been exposed to systemic failure for years?
Well, it depends on what you mean by systemic failure and from whose standpoint you call it a systemic failure. At the end of the day, all economics is about society. It is about real people. Now, if you know something about the structure of the Indian economy, the organized formal sector caters to a very small section of India. The vast majority of the Indian market system is very local, and it services the clientele that actually it can cater to. For example, in every slum in Mumbai, in every slum in everywhere else, you will find a thriving market. People buying and selling things, people, and it suits this slum dwellers' needs. It meets their needs. Now, it's not the kind of shopping that somebody in a more affluent place in Bombay would go to. But for the slum dweller, there is a market. For a small middle-class community, there are street markets. There are markets everywhere to cater to every level of society. Now, and I think we overlook this fact, and then we start talking about aggregated facts, leaving out the people. And what these reforms do is threaten to both take away all millions of people who depend on it for their livelihood, and for whatever reason, they are able to provide local services, which we...
Well, let me just bring in James Mayner, also in London, into the discussion here. James Mayner, Radha D'Souza seems to be saying there's a social demarcation here, but the government will say, hang on, we've reintroduced these measures in an effort to revive India's flagging economy. What's your assessment of the reforms? Are they necessary?
Well, the government thinks they're necessary. I'm not sure. The government's judgment is that despite the costs to small retailers, which Radha has rightly discussed, and the alienation of those people which will follow, that there will be improvements in all kinds of areas, not just in the retail trade, but in supply chains to farmers who will supposedly get a better deal and so on. We will see if the government's judgment is correct on the impact of that of the change, if the change is able to go forward. The government is also seeking, as it raises diesel prices, as it welcomes direct investment in several sectors, not just retail, they're trying to assert themselves, to take bold action after a period of serious drift and severe controversy over lots of allegations of corruption, lots of missteps that the government has had. They're trying to get themselves moving again before the 2014 election. So there is a political motive behind these economic decisions. And the government is risking the collapse of its coalition of numerous parties. One is already apparently going to leave in protest in order to show that it's asserting itself and that it's capable of forceful action.
Chetan Sharma, some interesting points there from James Mayner and Radha D'Souza. Of course, many people say the policy is correct, but it's the way the government is going about this. I mean, the fear is, for example, that if Walmart suddenly turns up in India in force, why would people then go to the small corner shop? There's a huge amount of social resistance to this.
Well, let me just address both the points, and I agree with Radha as well as James, but they have a different point of view on each subject. See, Radha talked about a threat to small shopkeepers, which is true. But if you look at the overall scenario where jobs are going to be filled, the government estimates, and perhaps with reason, that 10 million new jobs are going to be created. Now, this is a government that's talking about inclusive growth. So from that point of view, perhaps they're fair. Now, secondly, it's important to understand that the government at the center has made it a state subject, which means that it's the prerogative of the state whether they want to allow FDI or not. Now, as of now, out of the 28 states, only 9 have shown interest, which means it's not necessary that they have to go in for FDI. If they feel it's going to threaten the social environment, society as a whole, or the entire fabric, well, so be it. The third thing is you've got to understand the situation right now. We have a situation in this country. India is the second largest producer of fruits and vegetables. 1/4 of that produce goes out into wastage. 7% of our grains rot, and only 1 out of 7 tons of veggies go through the cold storage, which means we get food that is more expensive, that is not necessarily fresh, and of course, that's a bulk of that portion of the money of that fruit goes to the middleman, which means the farmer gets a poorer price and we as a consumer get a higher price. Now, why is that? That's happening because the bulk of the money goes to the middleman as well as inefficiencies in infrastructure.
Okay.
Now, if you look at the FDI retail norms, a high portion of the FDI has to be spent back into infrastructure and cold chain as well as logistics, which is going to dramatically reduce the price, reduce the interim chain management margins, and bring a higher price for the farmer and a lower price for the consumer. That's exactly what we want in a society that's suffering very highly from inflation.
Okay.
Now, addressing James' point of view from the political scenario. Yes.
No, go on, that's fine.
James' point of view on the political scenario, and he's right when he says that there's a threat to the government because one of the allies are pulling out, but there are enough allies to support the decision. Yes, what's going to happen is that the allies that come into context now are going to weaken the coalition. They're going to demand a higher bang for the buck. But if to suggest that the government is going to fall because of this, it doesn't look like.
Okay, all right. Let's bring in back Radha in London. Radha, we'll come back to the politics of it in just a minute. Let's talk about some of the safeguards to this FDI, if we can. There are conditions to these foreign groups who want to invest in India. Companies have to spend at least $100 million. They can only open outlets in towns with a population of over 1 million people. And they have to source at least 30% of produce from India. Now, that surely is likely to stimulate the Indian economy and grow jobs, as Chetan Sharma is trying to say.
Yeah, but before we go into the safeguards, I think we need to contextualize what is happening with the retail sector. First of all, let us not speak about the retail sector, the opening up of the retail sector, as if it is something that just started in 2011. Yeah, this has been an ongoing process, and in small dribs and drabs, it has been going on at least since 2000. And since 2006, it has accelerated. So even before 2011, when the present reforms were introduced by the government, de facto, there were already big sections in the big cities at least. The malls had come into existence, and many of these were actually selling foreign goods and openly, and many retailers had already come in by that stage. So that's a bit of the context there. The reason why this is important is it's being made out today as if it is a tussle between the BJP-led opposition and the government. This is clearly not true. If you look at the economic reforms, these reforms, the retail sector reforms, are part of the overall economic reforms that have been ongoing since 1990s at least. Yeah, and therefore, much of these reforms, they don't require law changes because the law reforms, the statutory reforms, have already happened. In this case, the FERA, which is the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, was replaced with the Foreign Exchange Management Act in 1999. So since then, what the government has been doing is in bits and pieces, in small sectors, in small doses, trying to introduce the same kind of measures in various sectors. So just that's a bit of the context. I just want to take on this thing about employment because it is a crucial issue in India today, where there's massive job losses because of deindustrialization, because of various other factors. Now, everyone speaks about the 10 million jobs that the retail sector will bring in. They don't speak about the number of jobs that will be lost as a result of this, because every unemployed person takes on some sort of retail trade to just survive. So there is a subsistence economy that almost relies entirely on this. And then there are small, because of absence of other kind of opportunities for employment, people take on to retailing. Now, all of those things will be taken over. Yes, there will be 10 million jobs, perhaps. I don't know if that figure is correct and how that is calculated. But even if we take it to be correct, we cannot really take that without taking into account the jobs that will be lost as a result of
All right,
this.
let me bring in back James Mayner into the equation. James Mayner, what about then, as Radha D'Souza was mentioning there, ordinary Indians, like the millions of subsistence farmers, the millions of people who live on the poverty line, how are they likely to reap the rewards of FDI?
I think it may be irrelevant to them, largely irrelevant to them. But the government has massive programs to reach people, subsistence farmers, people without land, people with very marginal farms. It has created a rural employment guarantee scheme, which is the largest poverty program in history in the world. It has spent more than 50, in the first 5 years this government was in power. After 2004, it spent over $57 billion US on poverty programs for those groups who will have been left behind by FDI and globalization and economic growth. So the government has an array of initiatives to reach those people, but FDI will not probably reach those people. The government is gambling that more jobs will be created by the incoming companies in retail and other sectors then will be lost in the Indian economy, and we don't know whether they will be greater than that. The very small merchants who sell modest things on street corners may or may not be put out of work and ruined by this new initiative, especially since many state governments will not permit this to come to their areas. So we don't really know. The government is gambling that it will on balance, be a plus.
Chetan Sharma, James Mayner doesn't seem too optimistic that the ordinary man on the street in India will benefit. I mean, is this just fattening up the political class, or will it make any meaningful difference to the lives of millions of Indians?
No, I don't think it in any way fattens up the political class, because this is a move which largely is not going to go down well with the populace as a whole. Because when you talk about job losses, obviously there is a big question mark. So it's not a very popular move. It's a tough move. Now, let me just get back to the job front, because that is critical, as what Radha as well as James said. Let me give you a different perspective to that. Now, even if we assume that no new jobs will be created to the extent the government is saying, and we assume that the job loss is not going to be that much, let's say it's a neutral scenario. The number of jobs that are created are balanced out with the number of jobs that are lost. All right? So we have a situation where there's no incremental job enhancement. But at the end of it all, if we get a better produce at a cheaper price for all of us in urban as well as rural India, and our farmer gets a higher price, a better price for his produce, I guess we're on the right track. Now, if you look at the entire scenario, I live in New Delhi, right? What is happening today is that the Walmarts are, of course, not there in the cities, but you have very, very high-profile branded retail outlets in the city itself. Now, the small shops are actually trading with these outlets because they've got a location benefit. They go and buy a cheaper material from these outlets and they come and supply it to us in our various houses. So it's not that they're displaced. Their jobs remain just the way it is, because had they been displaced, there would have been a huge hue and cry happening even now. It's not about foreign monies coming in. It's about branded products that are coming in at a better price, at a better locality, in a better environment. It's fresh, it's healthy. And if it's been traded by that same very middleman, it's coming to me at a better price and he's making his money, so be it.
Okay.
So what's the harm? So even in the current context, no jobs have been lost, because had they been, there would have been a huge uproar against that.
Okay, Radha D'Souza,
it has to be taken into context about jobs.
Okay, Radha D'Souza wants to say something. Radha D'Souza, is there going to be this trickle-down effect that Chetan Sharma is talking about? I mean, will small shops on the street corner benefit from this, from these huge outlets?
The reforms started, the economic reforms started in 1990s, and at that time, trickle down was the key phrase that was used to sell the reforms. Well, we haven't seen much trickling down happening. I just want to pick up on, there was the last round of statistics which the government came out with in December, says 50% of the population are undernourished. Now, that doesn't look good, and it's not any kind of trickling down, and that tells you that the trickle down is really drying up pretty at a high level. Now, the point about this whole reform, there are too many ifs and assumptions that are being made here. The assumption is that the farmer will get a better price. Well, if we contextualize it, the reforms are coming at a time when the agricultural sector is really collapsing. We have seen 200,000 farmers commit suicide according to the government's own figures because the agrarian sector is not viable. We are, on the contrary, seeing large multinationals coming into the agrarian sector, pushing the poor farmer out. And interestingly, there are no bailouts. Governments are bending backwards to bail out all the banks and bank failures and financial sector failures. But there's been very little by way of any support for these farmers who are committing suicide. So where is the good price? Who is it going to go to? And this is the question. Who's going to benefit from the whole thing?
It's an interesting...
And similarly with...
I was going to just say, it's an interesting point you make about the issue of bailouts. James Mayner, let me come back to you, if I may. I mean, there are some observers who say that if these economic reforms in India aren't carried out, that India could actually go the way of Greece and others, but whereas Greece has got saviours with deep pockets in the European Union, India doesn't. So, I mean, is this the momentum that India so badly needs, broadly, do you think?
I think the Greek comparison is nonsense. India is still growing at a very fast rate, much faster than almost the entire world, and I really don't think that it's near crisis in any of the Greek variety. I also think we need to be very careful about speaking about assumptions of trickle-down economics being predominant. The economic reforms which were begun in 1991 were begun by Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, who told me very specifically in 1992 that he did not believe in trickle-down economics. Those were his words. He was liberalizing the economy in a very cautious and limited way compared to other countries in order for the economy to grow, in order for government revenues to grow so that government could have more money to do things for people left behind by economic growth and globalization. Now, for a long time, it seemed that this was a pipe dream, this was naive, but since 2003, government revenues have indeed taken off spectacularly in India, and as a result of this, the current government has been able to spend vastly in excess of any other government on poor people.
Okay, we're slightly running out of time.
This is not trickle-down economics.
Chetan Sharma, a final thought from you, please.
Well, it's very clear that, and I agree in a lot of ways with what James and Radha have said, but the fact of the matter is, in terms of economics, we're on the right path. The reforms are definitely required. Yes, you need a bit of tuning. What you said very correctly, that the policy itself is good. The implementation is questionable. And of course, that goes for most things as far as India is concerned. And we've got to see this in the light of the upcoming elections, the next budget, and the fact that we're running on a very high fiscal deficit and very high inflation. At the backdrop of that, perhaps this is a solution, not a short-term solution, a long-term solution, which may have short-term hiccups, which I guess all of us have to live with.
All right, we have to leave it there. Thank you to our guests, James Mayner, Chetan Sharma and Radha D'Souza. And thank you for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, email your thoughts to insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks again for watching. Goodbye for now.